So what is addiction? It's a gradual rewiring of the brain. It affects both the biology and the cognition, both the hardware and the software. So I'm going to try to explain that real quickly to you. So right here, I've got some Fun Dip candy. You've seen this before. You probably ate this at some point. You know how this works. This thing is the stick, and we're going to stick it in the sugar. But today, we're going to pretend that this is actually a neuron in your brain. And what we need to understand is what we call neuroplasticity. So this neuron right here, we're going to call it a dopamine neuron. It's a brain neuron. It basically works like this. You create some sticky spots on this, you stick it in there, and we're going to pretend that that's neurotransmitter chemicals attaching to this neuron, which is going to make this neuron fire. And when that neuron fires, that's when you have that feeling, and that feeling is feeling pretty good because this is a reward neuron. It's called a dopamine neuron. It's in the center of your brain. That's normal. That's the way it should work. But what happens when people take drugs? This is what happens. You overload, you flood the system with these outside chemicals that get through what we call the blood-brain barrier, and they get into there and they affect that neuron by loading it up with all of these neurotransmitters that affect it, like opioids do. This is not good. This is not healthy. What happens now, of course, is that you feel high. You don't feel just good. You feel extremely good, better than you've ever felt before, quite possibly. And so now you've got this effect. But the brain is a biological system, and biological systems adapt. That's what they're supposed to do. So what's it going to do? What the biological system could do, it does a lot of different chemical changes, is it dries itself out. It dries out. So now, if you try to flood it with chemicals again, it doesn't happen. That way you don't have that overabundance of feelings that the system knows that I'm not supposed to be feeling that loaded up chemical feeling all the time. But here's another thing that happens is that because it's dried out, when you go through a normal day, you don't get that neuron to fire in the same way. Things just don't feel as good to you. They feel kind of dull and sad and depressing, and you want to feel good again, so what are you going to do? You're going to take more drugs. Now what's happening is you're also building up tolerance. The neuron has started to dry itself out. You've got to take more chemical to try to get that neuron to fire the same amount as it did before. It builds up more tolerance. We call that, by the way, neuroplasticity. As the brain system adapts to the things happening to it, it's kind of plastic, and we call that neuroplasticity. Unfortunately, this happens a lot when you're in your teen years. It happens tremendously from 0 to 4, and again as a teenager. So teenagers have neuroplasticity more than us old people do, and what's happening then is that their system is changing rapidly, which is making them become addicted. They get addicted fast because the brain adapts to all of those outside chemicals. So I want to try to answer the question today, what is addiction? And we said addiction is a gradual rewiring of the brain. And that means it has implications on both your biology and your psychology, right? So using the computer metaphor for just a minute, you can think of your biology as the hardware and the psychology as your software. Right? So your mind kind of runs this software. That's how you think of things. That's how you have desires and wants and needs and everything like that. I want to use a piece of software that I know you're all familiar with, and that would be a search engine. Maybe a search engine like Amazon's search engine, but you could use Google or Facebook or any other kind of software. So what happens is, you type something in there, and then it runs off and it does a bunch of software processing. We'll call that psychological processing, and then presents the answers back to you, and that's kind of like your consciousness. Like, this is the limited amount of things that you see, but behind the scenes there was all that software processing and checking with databases and rank ordering things, and then bam, you get this back. Right? So that's how your mind works. You have a lot of low-level, what we call it, below consciousness processing of software, and what's on top of that is that consciousness. Like, you get to see the tip of the iceberg. So let's imagine you've got Amazon open someday and you decide you're going to type in shoes. So you type shoes, and what does Amazon do? It presents you with a bunch of shoes. Here it is, you've been thinking about shoes, you want some shoes, you got shoes, buddy, no problem. Now you know how this works too, because you know that you've done this before, that the next day when you come back to Amazon, it's already going to be preloaded with a couple of pictures of shoes. Because Amazon has learned that, yeah, well, you like shoes. You like to search for shoes and socks and related kinds of things. So you now have that kind of in there. It's almost like your mind is already preloaded to think at least a little bit about shoes. Well, what happens when the day comes and you decide to experiment with drugs? Well, you type drugs into the Amazon search engine, you're going to get drugs back, right? And I tell you what, drugs are a very powerful psychological phenomenon. They feel really good. It's like you told Amazon, man, that's the best thing I have ever bought in my life. What does it do? It learns, right? It learns that, oh, well, tomorrow you wake up, I think we're going to let you think about drugs again, right? You're thinking about shoes too, but you're now kind of thinking about drugs too because it felt so darn good to you. That's that software processing below the surface. You're not trying to think about drugs, it just kind of pops up into your consciousness, maybe a couple of times throughout that day. The way Amazon is just kind of popping up those things that it learned you kind of like. So you get up the next day, oh, there's a little bit of things in there. You might think about drugs again, or cigarettes, or smoking stuff. You wake up another day, oh, sure enough, they're kind of there again. You're thinking about a little bit more drugs here and there. And then you don't want to think about drugs, you want to think about Mexican food. So you type Mexican food in, and sure enough, Amazon presents you Mexican food, but mixed in there are still going to be some thoughts, some desires about drugs, right? Because the software is learned. It's a very gradual process, right? Amazon kind of gradually learns what you like as well. So you wake up another day, you're not really thinking about drugs, but it pops up occasionally, and so you try another dose. Right? Somebody offers you one, maybe you think I'll experiment one more time, and sure enough, again, the rush, all of that experience, it's getting coded by the software. It's like, man, you must really like this thing called drugs. It might be alcohol. You wake up the next day, and now there's even more drugs in your consciousness, right? You think about more than you would. You want it a little bit more than you did the day before. And then every day after that, it's still in there. And you try it again. It gets stronger and stronger. And every day going forward now, the software that's below the level of your consciousness is telling you want drugs. Right? It's almost as if Amazon decided the only thing you want is drugs. It's only going to show you drugs. You type Mexican food, you're going to get drugs because that's what the software learned. Now, there was no moment in there where you decided, I think I only want drugs, right? It's a gradual process. You didn't decide you want to be addicted to drugs, but you trained the software to want drugs. That's what addiction is like.